On this episode of Skeptiko, Dr. Jeffrey Long responds to criticisms of evidence of the afterlife.
When you talk to the patients that have actually survived CPR, one thing that is very, very obvious is that the substantial majority of them are actually confused or amnesic. If you read even a few near-death experiences, immediately you realize that there's essentially none of them that talk about confusional episodes or, altered mental status where they just don't understand what's going on. In fact, in the survey we did, we found 76% of people having a near-death experience said their level of consciousness and alertness during the NDE was actually greater than their earthly everyday life. But also, in addition to that, note that the substantial majority of people that have a near-death experience associated with cardiac arrest are actually seeing their physical body well prior to the time that CPR is initiated. And once CPR is initiated, you don't see any alteration in the flow of the near-death experience, suggesting that whatever blood flow might be going back to their brain is affecting the content, modifying it at all in any way. I'll tell you another thing, too. If you were doing CPR and that were accounting for memory, I would tell you what you would hear a lot more from near-death experiencers. They would talk about their remembrance of the pain of the chest compressions. Alex, that's a fairly painful procedure. It often breaks ribs and hurts. And yet, even when you have a patient who had a cardiac arrest and had a near-death experience, essentially never do you hear them describing as part of their near-death experience the pain of chest compressions. Again, it's the evidence just simply does not support Dr. Worley's speculation.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, as promised, I have a follow-up interview with Dr. Jeffrey Long, and he's here to respond to the points raised by Dr. G.M. Worley in the last episode of Skeptiko regarding near-death experience and evidence for the afterlife. If you've been following along on this discussion, and even if you haven't, I think the interview is pretty self-explanatory, so let's get right to it. We're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Long, a practicing physician. He's a radiation oncologist and a near-death experience researcher. His book, Evidence of the Afterlife, is the most comprehensive study of NDEs ever published, and it's been a huge success. Dr. Long, welcome back to Skeptiko.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be back here with Skeptiko, and we certainly got plenty to talk about today.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. As many of the listeners know, you appeared on Skeptiko, I think it was last month, and then we invited Dr. G.M. Worley, an anesthesiologist from the Netherlands, and he came on to discuss his criticisms of your research conclusions and to explain why he thinks NDEs are not proof of an afterlife. So I'm very grateful that you're able to come back on and have some time to respond to Dr. Worley's comments.
Yeah, certainly my pleasure to do so.
So here's what I thought we'd do. Let's jump right into this, and here's where I'd like to start, and that is with the research, because it's a point that seems to create some confusion. And I was watching the interview you did with Bill O'Reilly on Fox, and I thought that was a great example of where a guy, Bill O'Reilly in this case, he becomes completely sidetracked with this anecdote thing. These are just anecdotes, and we can't really trust them because they're anecdotes. So I thought you should talk a little bit about survey work and medical research, and that how when you ask one person about their NDE, you may have an anecdote, but when you compile a 150 question survey of 600 people, you have something much more than that.
Boy, you just almost answered it right there. No doubt about it. When you have an anecdote, just simply means one or a few, if you will, case studies, and you have to be very hesitant to draw conclusions about small numbers. It would be like testing a new drug on 3 patients and trying to find sweeping conclusions about its effectiveness. You really can't. You need much more data than that. And that's why the study that I presented in the book is certainly vastly beyond anecdotal evidence. We actually studied 1,300 near-death experiences. So, it's certainly not just a limited number of case reports. And you're right, our modern questionnaire is over 150 questions. So no doubt we have the depth of analysis as well. And the most of the research that's published in the book was based on surveying over 600 near-death experiencers that filled out the most recent version of the questionnaire. Well, let me start out with sort of a basic scientific overview, and that is what's real is consistently observed. So we've observed evidence of the afterlife and near-death experiences not only in the vast number of near-death experiences studied in tremendous depth in my own study, but all my major findings are corroborated by scores of prior scholarly studies. So we're way beyond what could reasonably be called anecdotal. We're really in very hardcore evidence based on my work and the work of many others.
One other point that came up, and this was in the interview that I had with Dr. Worley, and that, first of all, he acknowledged that your research is solid, that your database is solid, which is good to hear. But then he had one point about the survey methodology that I'd like to talk about. And he suggested that perhaps your survey is biased in favor of people who have a certain kind of NDE. Now, he articulated it a little bit differently, but can you talk about any concerns that someone might have about that your survey is biased or that you're just pulling accounts of a certain kind?
Well, actually, his actual quote, as I recall it, was referencing the fact that if people had basically non-NDE experiences or very brief experiences, that they wouldn't necessarily be in the research, and that's not true at all. What we did with our INDER study is we've studied every single person who has a near-death experience. In other words, they nearly died and they had an experience. And then in addition to that, we used the most validated research tool in near-death experience research, and that's called the NDE scale. So we analyze every single person that has such an account. And in fact, we post every single near-death experience on the website for the people that give us permission, which is over 95%. So we not only have a very valid, comprehensive look at near-death experience because of the numbers, but in addition to that, we share that with the world so everybody else can see the data set that we're seeing too.
Great. And I think I even recall you saying that you don't necessarily include all the accounts because some accounts don't qualify under the criteria that you would use for a near-death experience.
And that's a good point. We post all near-death experiences, but good gosh, we have people that have life-threatening events but no experience whatsoever, and we simply don't have the resources to post every single one of those, and I don't think that really advances our knowledge of near-death experience or anything else. Other experiences are shared are clearly dreams, after-death communications, spontaneous out-of-body experiences, meditation experiences. So all of those are most of the time they're not posted. Occasionally we do, and we label them by their proper label. But as for our study set and what's important for our focus of study is near-death experience, and we have all of our near-death experiences analyzed in our data set.
Great. So it's important then acknowledge one more time that there are these criteria that have been well established by the research that's been going on for over 20 years in near-death experience.
So it's a good point. What is and is not a near-death experience has been pretty well established over the years. My criteria for near-death experience is pretty much what everybody else is using, especially with the use of the NDE scale. So we're using the best research methodologies to determine what is and is not a near-death experience. And in fact, in the over a decade that I've been doing this, I haven't heard from a single near-death experience researcher that had concerns about the methodology we were using for what we call a near-death experience and not a near-death experience.
So next, let's talk about the 9 lines of evidence that you present in your book, Evidence of the Afterlife, and that Dr. Worley tried to refute when he was on. And I want to get to as many as we have time for, but before we dig into each one, I thought I might ask you about the overall gist of Dr. Worley's argument, because it kept coming up time and time again, and that's this kind of rare counterexample thing. So if you say, as you do, that you studied 26 cases of NDEs under general anesthesia, then he comes back and says, yeah, but every once in a while, I think it's like 1 in 10,000, people have regained some consciousness during anesthesia. And then you say, well, that's not only extremely likely, but if it did happen, then the symptoms would make it unlikely that they would have this lucid experience. And then he comes back and says, yeah, but there are some cases where people did have a lucid experience. So it just goes on and on like this and then you step back and you say, what are really the odds of this 1 out of 10,000 thing happening in every single case? And on top of that this even rarer occurrence of them not experiencing the normal symptoms. And on top of that their experiences would match up with all the people that had a different set of medical conditions. As you would normally look at this in science, at some point, doesn't it just become so enormously, the odds become enormously outrageous that you wouldn't even go there?
Well, that's a real good point. I agree with everything you said, Alex, and there's even more. In fact, if you look at the book Evidence of the Afterlife on page 103 to 104, I talk directly about this so-called anesthetic awareness that Dr. Worley discusses. As an overview, let me say that these anesthetic awareness experiences are so very, very rare that I hope this never dissuades anybody from having medically appropriate general anesthesia. Please don't let any of the discussion here be an issue in preventing appropriate medical care. But as I say in the book, and this is a direct quote, rather than the type of coherent NDEs you read here, anesthetic awareness results in a totally different experience. And I provide a number of references on that, by the way, for interested listeners. I go on to say those who experience anesthetic awareness often report very unpleasant, painful, and frightening experiences. Unlike NDEs, which are predominantly visual experiences, this partial awakening during anesthesia more often involves brief and fragmented experiences that may involve hearing, but usually not vision. And again, I emphasize that anesthetic awareness is very rare under anesthesia. And by the way, I'm not aware of any near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia on the NDERF website that describe the typical content of anesthetic awareness experiences. Dr. Worley brings up a few anecdotal discussions about anesthetic awareness, but I have a number of references. So these are the scholarly people that have actually studied a number of anesthetic awareness experiences and published them in peer-reviewed journals in the past. That's my source of evidence, and as all your listeners can easily see, you just don't have near-death experiences that are predominantly hearing but no vision. You don't essentially ever have near-death experiences that involve brief fragmented experiences that are painful, that are frightening. In fact, none of the general anesthesia near-death experiences that I'd reviewed had any of those components of them. So really there's no doubt about that. These are completely different experiences, that being anesthetic awareness and near-death experiences. And I don't think Dr. Worley quite got that point, how clear that was, how crystal clear the distinction between those two types of experiences is.
Yeah, and I guess that gets to the larger question there that I'd ask, and that's, how do you counter these arguments? How do you counter these arguments that don't really make sense, but because they come from people who should know better, and because they're said with such conviction over and over again, it doesn't match the data. Even though Dr. Worley was picking out anecdotes that he thought were appropriate, they still didn't even match the data, as you're saying that they didn't give us the results we would expect to find. And yet we were never able to really get there in my discussion with him. How do you engage? How do you carry out a scholarly or an intellectual discussion along those lines?
Well, first of all, I have a lot more confidence in your listeners. I think they have a lot more of a scholarly open-mindedness than your discussion with Dr. Worley was. So I think and I have confidence in the substantial majority of people, that being when they hear evidence and it's presented very straightforward, that they're smart enough to understand what's real evidence and what supports the evidence and what's basically evasiveness in trying to deal with a particular line of evidence. So I guess part of it is I have confidence in your listeners. I have confidence in the great majority of people that understand the issues, and I have confidence in humanity. I admit it's a little bit frustrating when people don't directly respond to the evidence. It's very carefully documented, referenced, and even corroborated with scores of prior studies. But I think the best we can do, and you've been doing this for a long time, Alex, is just simply calmly bring forward the facts, discuss exactly what the issues are, respond to any reasonable arguments that anybody brings up against the lines of evidence, and just go forward.
Well, let's touch on statistics for a minute, because this is another rat's nest that I encounter sometimes with folks who have one position or another. And sometimes people want to grab onto statistics, but other times, like in this case, they seem to want to run from them. In your normal medical research, at what point do you reach a level where you say, gee, it's overwhelmingly suggestive that this is what's happening? How do you ferret all that out?
Yeah, I think that's a lot. A lot of it's depend on the number of patients studied and how strong the statistical evidence is. At other times it's just simply obvious by inspection. For example, when we talked about near-death experiences under general anesthesia, out of 33 elements of near-death experience, we compared between NDEs under general anesthesia and all other elements. In 32 of under all other types of causes of near-death experience, in 32 out of 33 elements studied, there was no statistical difference